Carthage was the only great empire of the ancient world that never meant to be one. For 300 years, it was just a stopover town of 30,000 people, a place where sailors dried their sails, merchants counted their silver, and everyone moved on. No army, no ambitions, not even its own currency. And then, this city suddenly found itself ruling half the Mediterranean, with a fleet of 200 warships, mercenaries from across the known world, and 6-story apartment buildings, 2,000 years before anyone else would build that high. Today, we are going to tell you the story of how a colony of Phoenician refugees became a trading superpower that held the entire Mediterranean Sea in its grip for 600 years. About the first citywide sewer and water supply system in history, about warships assembled like IKEA furniture, with building instructions written right on the parts, about a mercenary army whose battlefield graves hold people from across the globe, DNA clusters from the Baltic to the Sahara in a single burial, about Hannibal, who marched elephants over the Alps and spent 15 years crushing Rome on its own soil, and about why the richest city in the ancient world lost, not to someone stronger, but to someone who knew how to lose and get back up. The story of Carthage does not begin in Africa. It begins on the other side of the Mediterranean, on a narrow strip of coastline that we call Lebanon today. The territory of modern Lebanon was the homeland of the Phoenicians, a civilization that survived the Bronze Age collapse, and in the Iron Age began spreading across the Mediterranean. Phoenician merchants from Tyre, Sidon and Byblos established colonies everywhere, from Spain to Cyprus, mostly for silver and trade. This colonization ran parallel to the Greek one. Where one group settled, the other usually stayed away. Around 750 BC, settlers from Tyre founded a colony on the coast of North Africa. In Phoenician, it was called Kort Hadasht, New City. The founding legend is a good one. A Tyrian princess named Dido fled from her murderous brother, sailed to Africa, and asked a local plot of land the size of an ox hide. When they agreed, she cut the hide into the thinnest possible strips, tied them together, and marked off 75 acres of coastline. Archaeology confirms the core of the story. Carthage really was founded by political refugees, and they really did buy land from the locals. For the first 300 years, nothing remarkable happened to the city. Carthage sat in a convenient spot, roughly midway along the route from Spain to Lebanon, and served as a transfer point. Ships pulled in, crews rested, cargo was reloaded, and everyone sailed on. Nearby stood Utica, an older and more important colony. The population of Carthage never exceeded 30,000, a decent city, but nothing special. Everything changed in the 6th century BC. The Persian Empire conquered Phoenicia. Tyre, the city whose settlers had once founded Carthage, lost its freedom, and it was Tyre that had coordinated all Phoenician trade across the Mediterranean for centuries. Who sailed where, who carried what, who traded with whom. Now there was no one to manage it, but the trade itself had not gone anywhere. Carthage sat right in the middle of every route. It picked up what Tyre had dropped. Around the same time, that same Persia created another problem for Carthage, an indirect one. The Persians began pushing against the Greeks on the eastern coast, and thousands of Greeks fled west. Previously, Phoenician and Greek colonists had settled apart and stayed out of each other's way. Now there were no good spots left, and Greek settlers began founding colonies right next to Phoenician cities. The closer a Greek sits to your trade route, the less trade reaches you. For the first time in its existence, Carthage was forced to build a war fleet, not for conquest, but to protect its commerce. Together with the Etruscans, it assembled a fleet that defeated the Greeks in the Sardinian Sea in the 530s BC. A trading city began turning into a military power, not by choice, but by necessity. But where did Carthage get its soldiers if it had no army of its own? In the Greek world and in Rome, citizenship was inseparable from military service. You were a citizen, so you picked up a shield and stood in formation. The entire political system grew out of this principle. In Carthage, everything was structured completely differently. The elites were traders. Their power and influence were defined not by willingness to die for the city, but by the ability to multiply its wealth. And when the need to fight arose, they simply bought an army. Mercenaries were recruited from across the Mediterranean. Balearic slingers, Ligurian spearmen, Iberian swordsmen, Numidian cavalry, Celts, Greeks, even people from the far north of Europe. At the excavated burial site of the Battle of Himera, DNA analysis showed that a single grave held people from literally across the known world, genetic clusters from the Baltic, North Africa, and the Pyrenees. The only thing uniting this army was Carthaginian officers and Carthaginian money. The system worked brilliantly for short wars. Every 10 to 15 years, a conflict flared up with the Greeks on Sicily over control of some city. Carthage hired an army, fought, paid, and everyone went home. No one was drained, no one was stretched thin. By the 4th century BC, Carthage had grown to 100,000 residents and controlled western Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, and the North African coast. The city became so wealthy that Aristotle called its political system the best in the world, better than Sparta, better than Crete. And the city itself was an engineering marvel. 6-story residential buildings, 2,000 years before Europe would build anything comparable. A unified water supply and sewer system. Baths in every respectable home, positioned right at the entrance, presumably so you could wash off the outside world before stepping into the sacred space of the house. Mosaic floors. A military harbour with a circular basin holding 220 warships, invisible from outside with a signal tower on an island in the centre. Ships were built on an assembly line. On a sunken Carthaginian warship, archaeologists discovered that every timber block was labelled with instructions. Which piece attaches where? Build it yourself, like IKEA furniture. Only this is a warship. But this splendour had a dark side that still troubles historians to this day. What are the strange child burials that archaeologists keep finding in the very centre of the city? In the centre of Carthage, fortified like a citadel, stood the Tophet, a children's cemetery combined with a shrine. Ordinary cemeteries were placed outside the city walls. The Tophet stood inside. For a long time, historians debated whether these were sacrifices or simply burials of children who had died of natural causes. Infant mortality in the ancient world was staggering. Only half of all children born survived to age 10. Perhaps this was just a special way of burying babies? Over the past 30 years, archaeology has provided an answer, and it is not a comforting one. Tophets have been found not only in Carthage, but in dozens of Punic settlements across the western Mediterranean. The children in these burials are not just newborns. They range up to 3 or 4 years old. But most importantly, texts in the Phoenician language have survived alongside the burials, and they contain a recurring formula. I bring this sacrifice to my Baal-Hamon, because he fulfilled his part of the bargain, and now I fulfill mine. The god kept his promise. Here is the child. Over time, an additional note even appeared. Take notice, God, this is my own flesh and blood. Apparently, too often, Carthaginians would promise to sacrifice their own child, then buy a slave child and substitute it instead. Plutarch wrote about this directly. A wealthy Carthaginian strikes a deal with the god, goes to the market, buys a child, adopts it, and offers it as a sacrifice. The most striking fact is this: the peak of sacrifices in the Tophets coincides with the peak of the civilization. A city with sewers, 6-story buildings, and the best political system in the world was simultaneously offering children to its gods, and the richer it became, the more frequently. Nothing of the kind has been found in the historical homeland of Lebanon. All evidence suggests that this tradition was born here in the West, and where it came from remains an open question. But in the 3rd century BC, Carthage developed a problem far more serious than any internal contradiction. On the other side of the sea, a state had grown up that could do something Carthage could not do at all: lose and get back up again. The First Punic War. Punic simply means Phoenician in Latin, which is what the Romans called the Carthaginians, began in 264 BC over a ridiculous incident. A gang of former mercenaries had seized the city of Messina on Sicily, and sensing that Syracuse was about to crush them, sent messengers for help, some to Carthage, others to Rome. Carthage arrived first and placed a garrison in the city. The Romans sailed in after them and forced the Carthaginians out by threat of force. For Carthage, this was an act of open aggression. For Rome, it was protecting allies. A conflict that both sides considered routine, yet another skirmish over yet another Sicilian city dragged on for 23 years and became the longest continuous war in all of antiquity. This is where it became clear that Carthage's mercenary system had a fatal flaw. After every defeat, Rome switched on its famous vacuum. It sucked new soldiers out of its network of allies for free. A legion destroyed. A new one stood ready within a year. The fleet sunk, rebuilt within a year. Over the course of the war, Rome lost its entire fleet twice and rebuilt it twice. Rome had no money for mercenaries, but it had a system that produced soldiers the way Carthage produced ships. Meanwhile, Carthage would sail to Liguria, a region in northwestern Italy where mercenaries were traditionally recruited, and say, "We need a fresh batch." And the answer would come back, "We have no more volunteers." The inflation is visible right in the coins. The silver content drops with every year of war. Historians have calculated the scale of the problem. Income from the Spanish silver mines was roughly 1,800 talents per year, and military expenses ran to about 1,700. The empire earned everything and spent everything. Carthage lost the First Punic War, surrendered Sicily, and paid an enormous indemnity. And then it lost even worse, to itself. There was nothing left to pay the mercenaries who had come home. They mutinied, took their own commander prisoner, and a civil war erupted that was more brutal than any foreign conflict. Out of this chaos emerged a man named Hamilcar Barca, and he led Carthage to Spain to build a new empire. His 9-year-old son went with him. The father made the boy swear an oath to hate Rome forever. The boy's name was Hannibal. In 218 BC, Hannibal did what no one thought possible. He assembled an army in Spain, 50,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, and marched it to Italy on foot, not by sea, which Rome controlled, but overland, across the Pyrenees, through southern Gaul, over the Alps. The first serious obstacle was the Rhone River. Even at its narrowest point, it was 300 to 600 feet wide, with a powerful current. Hannibal's engineers felled trees, lashed the trunks together with ropes, and built rafts 200 feet long. They piled branches on top and covered them with earth, so the elephants would think they were walking on solid ground. On the opposite bank, hostile Gallic tribes were waiting, but when they saw elephants stepping off the rafts, they scattered in panic without striking a single blow. The entire crossing took 9 days. Then came the Alps. Early winter, ice-covered passes, a starving army. Enormous boulders blocked the trails, and Hannibal figured out how to move them. Soldiers built fires around the rocks, heated the stone, then poured boiling vinegar into the cracks. The rock split, and men broke it apart with iron tools. Half the army died on the march, from cold, hunger, avalanches, and clashes with mountain tribes. But those who descended into the valleys of northern Italy were a hardened force, ready to fight. For the next 15 years, Hannibal crushed Rome on its own territory. He destroyed the equivalent of 16 legions, killing consuls and senators by the dozen. Southern cities, Capua, Tarentum, switched to his side. Syracuse broke its alliance with Rome. Even Macedonia signed a treaty with Hannibal. In 216 BC at Cannae, the Carthaginian army encircled the Romans and delivered a slaughter the ancient world had never seen. 70,000 men were left dead on the field in a single day. Among the fallen, 80 senators and both consuls. It seemed Rome was finished, but Hannibal did not march on the capital. He had no siege equipment, and storming a city with massive fortifications, using only a field army, meant losing everything he had gained. He was waiting for reinforcements. His brother Hasdrubal was leading a second army from Spain, with catapults, ballistae, and fresh troops. If the two brothers joined forces, Rome would have had no chance. But the Romans intercepted Hasdrubal at the Metaurus and annihilated his army. They hurled Hasdrubal's severed head into Hannibal's camp. At that moment, the war was lost, even though it would drag on for another 13 years. Carthage surrendered. Rome took everything. It forbade Carthage from waging any war without permission from the Roman Senate and left it 10 warships for fighting pirates. It seemed like the end. But something remarkable happened. Without its empire, Carthage flourished even more. It turned out that maintaining overseas territories had consumed nearly all the city's income, and without those costs, the trading city grew wealthy again. So wealthy that 10 years later it offered to pay off its entire 50-year indemnity in one lump sum. Rome refused. As long as the payments continued, Carthage remained tied down and obedient, and the mere fact that the city could settle such a debt early frightened the senators more than it reassured them. And Senator Cato, having visited Carthage and witnessed its prosperity, began ending every single speech he gave, no matter the subject, with one phrase: Carthage must be destroyed. The excuse came in 149 BC. Numidia, a neighboring kingdom allied with Rome, had been biting off pieces of Carthaginian territory for years. Carthage sent complaints to Rome, asked for permission to strike back, and was refused every time. Finally, the Carthaginians could take no more and fought the Numidians on their own. Rome instantly declared this a violation of the peace treaty. You waged war without our permission, and dispatched an army. Carthage desperately tried to avoid war. It did everything Rome demanded. Handed over the politicians who had advocated resistance to Rome for execution, surrendered all weapons, disbanded its army. Total capitulation, without a single battle. Then the Romans issued their final condition: leave your city. We will level it to the ground. Go into the African interior, work the fields, live as farmers. There will be no more city. When Carthaginian envoys brought these terms home, the townspeople tore them apart on the spot. Carthage chose to fight. 3 years of siege. Women gave their hair to be twisted into bowstrings for catapults. Prisoners were released from the jails. Old men who had not touched a hammer in 20 years returned to the forges. In 2 months, the citizens produced 6,000 swords and 60,000 stone projectiles for catapults. When the Romans finally broke through the walls, street-by-street fighting went on for another 7 days. The last defenders barricaded themselves in the citadel on the Bursa Hill and set themselves on fire. The city's population, once as high as 300,000, was reduced to 50,000 survivors. All were sold into slavery. The city burned for 17 days. In that same year, 146 BC, Rome destroyed Corinth on the other side of the Mediterranean in exactly the same fashion. For Carthage, this was the end. For Rome, it was just another Tuesday. But Carthage did not disappear. It was burned, its ground was cursed, its people were sold into slavery, and 100 years later, Julius Caesar ordered the city rebuilt on the same spot. Only now it was a Roman Carthage, with Latin inscriptions, Roman temples, and Roman officials. Baal Hammon, the supreme god to whom Carthaginians had offered sacrifices for centuries, received a new name, Saturn. Tanit, the patron goddess of the city, became Juno. Even the word Carthago in Latin was feminine. For the Romans, Carthage was always her, something womanly, seductive, and dangerous. But beyond the city walls, in the villages and the fields, nothing changed. The farmers kept speaking the Phoenician language. They kept working the same land with the same Phoenician plows that the Romans themselves would later adopt. They kept burying children in Tophets, a tradition that would outlast the city's destruction by another couple of centuries. 350 years after the fall of Carthage, the Roman emperor would be Septimius Severus, a man from Leptis Magna, an old Punic colony on the coast of Libya. His son Caracalla would make a pilgrimage to the tomb of Hannibal, the general Rome had once cursed and now revered as a legend. And the sharp-tongued courtiers would joke about the Severus family. Sure, they are emperors, but you cannot hide those Punic roots. 350 years after Carthage was destroyed, and the word Punic still worked as an insult. And another 200 years after that, Augustine of Hippo, one of the fathers of the Christian Church raised in North Africa, would run into the same thing. In Rome, people would occasionally call him a pun, simply because he came from former Carthaginian lands, even though he was a Roman citizen who spoke Latin. One day, he would walk into the fields outside the former Carthage and ask the farmers what language they spoke, and he would hear a single word in reply: Hanan, Canaanite, the very language the Phoenicians had spoken when they founded their first colonies 3,000 years before. Carthage began with a handful of refugees who bought a scrap of land from the Numidians and started growing wheat on it, and it ended with farmers growing the same wheat on the same land. Only now they prayed to Saturn instead of Baal Hammon, and to Juno instead of Tanit. The names of the gods changed. The language of the empires above their heads changed 3 times over, but the people ploughed the same earth and spoke the same tongue, and outlasted everyone. Rome wiped Carthage off the map, but it wasn't the first time someone destroyed a great city. 500 years earlier, the same thing happened to Babylon, and Babylon came back. How? That's the next video.